1890s were the time when Ellen White wrote the most on education. 1891, they had a revival meeting, you might say, of Adventist educators in northern Michigan, but that was part of a larger movement in Adventism. In 1888, there was a reemphasis on Christ and His righteousness and putting the Bible back at the center. And after those meetings, they had a series of meetings for the ministers to help them understand. And in 1891, they had a meeting in Harbor Springs in Michigan that helped the teachers understand where the Bible and Christianity fit into education.
There was a convention in 1891 called the Harbor Springs Convention. And Ellen White at that time came to the convention, and she brought the theology of grace to the concepts of education. And in doing that, she gave a thrust, a power, a motivation to what we do in education, with this understanding that we can't separate our theology and our educational system. And so for me, Ellen White brought this all together.
I think this affected education in that the events of this conference made clear even to Ellen White and those who were speaking with her to this issue of faith versus law keeping, made even clear how crucial this was as the center of everything that we do. Faith in Jesus and the knowledge of God and knowing God should be the center of education. And so all these other things that we had been distracted with, the Greek classics, learning about ancient Rome, etc., those aren't the center. Those are the things that should be the little things in the picture with the cross of Christ center. The same goes for health and publishing. In the ways that we care for others, if Jesus is not the center of that, then it's not Adventist health. In what we publish, if Jesus is not the center of that, then it's not Adventist publishing. And so this passion, this change, it was almost like things took a turn at that time to say, no, it really is your relationship with Jesus. And I think that Adventist education and some of the other things that are particular to what we do have sort of turned and then they turn back. And there are people who come along to turn them back. And whenever people come along to turn them back to a saving relationship with Jesus and focusing on our faith, there will always be, as there were with Battle Creek College, some who disagree. And they disagree enough that perhaps they leave the endeavor. It's the way people make choices. But we must always be moving back to this idea that education at its core is restoring the image of God in us because we believe that Jesus died for our sins.
Si bien los primeros intentos informales por tener una educación adventista fueron a nivel primario, no fue hasta mucho tiempo después de la inauguración de la primera institución superior que comenzaron a surgir nuevas iniciativas intentando traer a los niños a esta educación diferente, esta educación basada en la palabra de Dios.
The earliest Adventist primary institutions failed, 1850s, 1860s. But by 1870s, we had a need for training of mature workers, so we developed colleges, and that spread up to the 90s. But when Ellen White was in Australia, she found something she did not find in the United States. Namely, in Australia, they had compulsory education. In other words, children must be in school by the age of 6. The government said they had to go to school. And so she said, we ought to have primary schools where children can go to school in a Christian environment. And she wrote very specifically, where we have churches that have as few as 6 children, we ought to create a school. And here's where Sutherland and McGann really did a good thing. They picked that up and they created Adventist schools all over the place.
As a result of that conference, educational convention, there was a real spur by Sutherland, McGann, and others to get some of our college young people, and they tended to favor women, single women, out there into the local churches to start church schools. And the number of church schools just really spiked.
Adventist schooling, elementary schooling, after 1895, the number of schools goes straight up. I mean, you got 16 in 1890, you got hundreds by 1900, and soon we had almost 1,000 by 1910. And so the number of schools, this is one of Ellen White's most successful councils. Wherever you have a church with as few as 6 children, we should have a Christian school.
O bonito das primeiras escolas adventistas espalhadas pelos Estados Unidos e em outros lugares é que, normalmente, a educação e a igreja caminhavam juntas. Então, não era um sistema educacional paralelo. Eram igrejas-escolas. Durante a semana, o lugar de cultos era usado com carteiras e onde se aprendia, se davam aulas. E no sábado, aquela mesma escola virava o lugar de adoração. Então, elas eram totalmente fundidas. Isso era bonito, é nossa escola e nossa igreja. Esse modelo de igreja-escola ou escola-igreja mostra o quão integrada a educação estava à vida religiosa da igreja.
Cuando se comprende que educar es redimir, escuela es más que un centro de estudios, es un lugar de formación para la eternidad. Un establecimiento donde se imparte una educación que restaura, que fortalece y que nos conduce hacia el mañana con esperanza. Creyendo profundamente en esto, las iglesias establecieron un compromiso con la educación, no sin esfuerzo, no sin desafíos, pero avanzando firmes y confiando en los sabios consejos concedidos por Dios.
The main challenge at first, there were some rather mundane hurdles to overcome. Funding. You know, how would we pay for the schools? Finding teachers. Finding textbooks. So these were some, finding locations. These were some mundane considerations. But then there were ideological considerations. What should we teach? And how are our schools different from others? You might have already covered that our early schools were much like the other schools around them, the non-Adventist schools, in terms of they taught Latin, Greek, they taught the classics, they read from novels and things like that. And so Adventists had to develop a distinct type of pedagogy.
If you look at the history of education in the United States at the time, there was a big argument about whether science was the knowledge of most worth, or whether it was the classics, or whether it was the skills to do a job. And Ellen White comes along and she says, science is important and the skill to do a job is important. And so she doesn't see a battle and a war. She says some of the classical stuff is not so important. But even there, she said, we need to understand philosophy. We need to understand the way people think if we want to minister to them. So what Ellen White says, all of these things are important. But the most important thing, the real knowledge of most worth, is the knowledge of God, the experiential knowledge of God. And the way that we gain that experience is through His Word. So that's what she was trying to get us to do in our schools. And the challenge was that people didn't really understand this kind of an education.
As Ellen White saw what was happening with the early Adventist schools, particularly with Battle Creek College, she saw that the teachers who went out to start schools had been trained at that college. And as that college was leaning more toward a secular approach to education, they were creating little models of themselves to go elsewhere. And she saw that this would not promote the knowledge of God. And so she was very concerned. And I think that's why she got so passionate about it. Because we're going down this wrong track. This wrong track is education. It's going to affect the future of our church. And so I must write about it. Where should it be going? How can we turn this ship another direction? It's the future of our church.
Elena de White estaba convencida del valor de la educación. Su relación estrecha con Dios la había llevado a comprenderla y ahora se sentía responsable de explicar y orientar a los educadores adventistas hacia el concepto real de la verdadera educación. Misión que, a diferencia de otras, le tomaría gran parte de su ministerio y su vida, convirtiendo la educación adventista en uno de sus consejos más difíciles de aceptar, comprender y aplicar para los pioneros de su tiempo.
At first, through the writings of Ellen White, we said, okay, we only want to teach from the Bible. This was the interpretation of Ellen White. Ellen White didn't say that, but there were some fanatics who said, we only want to have the Bible as a textbook. Even for things like biology and, let's say, math, and we only want to have the Bible. And so this was one extreme. And the other extreme was not to have the Bible at all, have the Latin classics and the Greek mythology and different things like that. And so one of the challenges was dealing with extremes. Another challenge was, finding out exactly what we wanted to teach. There were obviously many subjects that we could teach, but what were the most important, and how can we find people to teach those subjects?
The early discussions in which Ellen White involved herself were not about the Bible as the textbook for every subject. She never advocated that. Interestingly enough, the early discussions had to do with Bible as a way to know God, but there was one other subject matter that got written about, and that was history. Because in knowing God, it's always about your story and my story. How do we know God? In which case, what happens with history? And the point that she made in terms of the subject or the discipline of history was, we must address the discipline of history in light of how has God been working through history? What decisions have people been making through history? The whole idea of the Great Controversy is a story of our history and our future and how God works in that. And that has to be a centerpiece of how we talk to students about history. But there are also some other things. We talk about the Bible as God's book, but we also talk about the nature as God's second book. And in Adventist education, we actually spend quite a bit of time on nature and how do we see God as He's revealed in nature. And it's very interesting. I was just reviewing some results from the Cognitive Genesis study that has been done recently from the Center for Research on Adventist Education right here at La Sierra University. And it shows that our students who go through their education integrating things of God with things of science, which is not typical in secular education, actually have a higher ability on the tests of science than do students who are in public school. So the emphasis on the things of God not only doesn't hurt these students when they're studying science, but they actually do better as they look at God's second book, and as they are thinking about science, they're also thinking about God. It's that kind of integration of learning and faith in history, in science, and in the other subjects that makes such a difference.
Como adventistas, debemos recapturar o reentender la cosmovisión bíblica. Y desde ese ángulo, entonces acercarnos a las materias que nos toca enseñar, hacer las conexiones naturales, hacer las preguntas que surgen de la materia. O sea, hay que ser cuidadoso. No convertir el aula de biología o de ciencias políticas en una arenga religiosa, un culto religioso. No, yo quiero enviar a mi chico para que aprenda bien matemáticas, o música, o historia, o literatura, o composición, etc. Quiero que aprenda bien eso, pero quiero que lo enmarque en la cosmovisión bíblico-cristiana. Que piense, para decirlo así, que aprenda a pensar cristianamente.
One of the most important things about helping to train young people is to help them to understand that the Bible and, of course, a knowledge of God is the foundation of all education. And that is what Seventh-day Adventist education is all about. Helping young people to understand a fundamental truth that God must be first in their lives, and that everything else fits into this incredible scheme of things. And that's why Seventh-day Adventist teachers are so important, people who are dedicated to the Lord, because they are building the characters of young people for the future here on this earth, and certainly for eternity.
Educar es la tarea más noble que puede ser encomendada al ser humano. Participar en la formación física y social de las futuras generaciones e instruirlos en inteligencia y sabiduría. Inteligencia en los diversos campos del conocimiento. Sabiduría que solo proviene de la palabra de Dios. Y como parte de la pedagogía es facilitar el aprendizaje, serán las herramientas de las que el educador haga uso las que podrán reducir o ampliar su influencia para que sus alumnos puedan retener o olvidar lo aprendido.
At first, there wasn't too much authorship of textbooks during the 19th century. That happens more in the early 20th century. Now we might find some exceptions, but they were tending to use materials that were already published by others and adapting them.
There were some elementary school teachers that actually started writing their own textbooks because they couldn't find textbooks out there in the field that integrated the Bible with whatever subject it was they were teaching. They didn't exist. Alma McKibben is one of the earliest ones. She actually typed up on her typewriter some of her early textbooks and then took shoestrings, punched holes in the manuscript, and tied them together as kind of an early primitive textbook for her own students out in California. So there weren't many to go to use at this time, textbooks.
When you come into the 20th century, you see more Adventist publications. I think a name that comes to my mind is W.W. Prescott. Of course, he came to Battle Creek College as well, and he's there during what's sometimes called the early golden years, after the Alexander McLaren debacle and that terrible problem that I mentioned. Soon thereafter, there's one other president in there or something, Little John, I think, kind of tides it over. But W.W. Prescott comes in, and he becomes the president there for several years. and the school enrollment grows dramatically. And although they haven't yet moved away from classics, there is a real attention to proper education. And then he, in later years, would be very much in the forefront of Adventist education and would encourage and also himself even author some textbooks that would be used. Were they all taking us back to the Bible? Some. I think that the ones certainly published by our presses were more message-centered. But this, I think, continued to be a little bit of a problem for us, to have the best, good educational publications, at least in the earliest 20th century.
There was a time when Adventists provided most of their own material, but there were not Adventist textbooks early on. This is a rather new phenomenon, although some things were done back during the early days. You know, our publishing work got started before education, so there was something. But we did not have a Seventh-day Adventist textbook company or organization. And so over the years, most of our years in education, we have had to draw on what we would call secular textbooks. And so there were all kinds of ways of approaching those. Sometimes we just purchased those directly from the publisher as they were. And I can remember, because at one time I was a teacher in church school, I can remember that we were told, just skip certain chapters, such as chapters in science on evolution. Just skip those and do the rest. And then there was a movement among many of us who felt, no, we should not just skip those. We should teach our young people how to deal with those. And so, for example, on evolution, just for example, I would have my students take assignments and questions from me, take those home and use Ellen White's writings, the Bible, sit down with their parents and work through those questions and issues and talk about why we believe what we believe, why we reject what is said in this book or that book. Because at some point they had to make decisions, and we wanted them to be able to do that. Then along the way we developed some supplements to those other textbooks. So sometimes we could skip those chapters, but we had replacement chapters that dealt with the material from an Adventist perspective. And then finally we started to publish our own textbooks, and now that is rather common all over the world.
La intención de la educación adventista de comprender todos los niveles de la formación educativa no se limitó solo a las instituciones de América del Norte. Rápidamente, este desafío fue extendiéndose a las demás instituciones que comenzaban a surgir en diferentes puntos de nuestro planeta. Y así, la educación adventista fue creciendo y tomando forma, asemejándose cada vez más a la red educativa extensa que conocemos hoy.
La historia de la educación adventista, si la miramos hoy, en el siglo XXI, nosotros podemos aprender de los errores y de los aciertos. Creo que podemos aprender de los errores, tratar de no cometer los mismos. Y en ese sentido creo que tenemos un desafío muy grande en términos del currículo, de qué se estudia. Porque qué se estudia es como el menú que a uno le dan para comer. Es decir, si yo soy lo que como, yo también soy lo que me alimento mentalmente. Y un plan de estudios es como una receta de cocina. Si le ponemos mucho de esto y poco de esto otro, nos vamos a enfermar porque no está balanceado. Entonces, creo que ese es un aspecto que todavía es un desafío. para los educadores adventistas.
One of the interesting things when we look at the history of how we developed our philosophy is that God didn't reveal everything all at once. A long time passed from 1844 to 1893 when together the Adventist educators said we need to have a Bible course every year and this is going to define who we are. And that's how God still works today. He works with people. He doesn't force us, and it's by working and consulting together and studying the Bible and coming to a studied position that we can collaborate globally.
I think the most important lesson we can learn is that education and learning how to educate in the best possible way is always a process. We don't start out perfectly. It's all an experiment, and we try to do the right thing. We try to study and figure out what the right ideas are. We try to pay attention to God's will, but we don't start out perfectly. We learn, we make mistakes, we learn some more, and we make adjustments, and we keep moving toward the best possible integration of our beliefs and our educational system.
Around the world, you will find that Bible has a central role. And the Bible is just not a source of information like any other source, but it is a source of revelation that guides all of life and sometimes even rebukes us and calls us to change our way. That's something that makes Adventist education unique. The Bible has a preeminent role, and in many of the logos that you see around the world, you'll see that there'll be often a triangle with mind, body, and spirit, and somewhere in that image there will be a picture of the Bible, because the Bible has a defining role. Everything that is done in Adventist education, whether it's the food that you eat in the cafeteria, the way the libraries are organized, and the types of books, all of that is seen through a biblical worldview that affects how we come to know what is true, how we come to know what is good and right behavior, ethical behavior, how we know what is beautiful even. That is also defined by a biblical worldview. Everything in Adventist education is working together to achieve one purpose, character development, to reflect the image of God completely, not just the mind, but completely in our students, and to prepare them for usefulness in this life and to prepare them for heaven ultimately.